I'm Hayden Lewis. I was born in 1956, just across the bay here, in a lovely little house that overlooks Cardiff Bay. Our favourite games were gully jumping and crab fighting. I was diagnosed with haemophilia at the age of 2. Bit my tongue actually, fell out of a high chair.
Hayden was one of 4,000 British haemophiliacs injected with contaminated blood. Nearly 1,800 have already died.
I've now reached the tender age of 52. And in all the years I've been treated for haemophilia, I've been exposed to hepatitis B, hepatitis C, hepatitis D, hepatitis E, HIV, and VCJD.
The doctors didn't tell Hayden in time that he had HIV, with awful consequences.
Unfortunately, through not being informed by the physicians, I've inadvertently infected my wife with HIV.
Hayden and his wife, Gaynor, came to London for today's announcement. Successive governments have refused to hold an official public inquiry. Lord Archer had no power to call witnesses or compel government to act, but he could set out what went wrong.
The procrastination in achieving national self-sufficiency to avoid the use of high-risk blood products from overseas had disastrous consequences. Had self-sufficiency been achieved earlier, the scale of the catastrophe would have been significantly reduced.
Lord Archer decided not to point the finger of blame at any individuals, but the evidence submitted shows there were two key periods of time when mistakes were made, during the 1970s and the 1980s. And many haemophiliacs blame the ministers who were in charge at the time.
Ministers should take that responsibility. You know, if we look back on what's happened, we know what's happened. It's been well documented. They must have known, they must have been aware. But to a certain extent they shut their eyes to what was going on, and nothing was done.
Decisions were made in full knowledge that they were going to risk people. So yes, I think ministers need to take responsibility for their actions.
Haemophiliacs had always had difficult lives, but from the early 1970s a simple treatment called Factor VIII became available, which seemed to be a breakthrough. It restored the ability of their blood to clot, but there was a problem. Britain relied on imports of Factor VIII from America, and the Americans paid prison inmates and drug addicts for blood which was often contaminated with hepatitis and other viruses. The first mischance to save haemophiliacs from hepatitis came under a Labour government in the mid-70s. David, now Lord Owen, was then the Health Secretary. He was aware of the danger from imported American blood, so he tried to make Britain self-sufficient in Factor VIII, made from healthy blood from volunteer British donors, but failed.
The decision was taken to go for self-sufficiency, and somewhere between 76 to early 80s, that was pushed on one side progressively, and Parliament was never informed, and people were given to believe that their safeguards would be put in place, and safeguards were not put in place.
The second mischance came under a Conservative government. In March 1982, warnings started to circulate in the Health Department about a new virus that had infected 400 haemophiliacs in the US, what became known as HIV/AIDS.
Half of the Factor VIII bought from commercial companies is imported from the USA, where drug addicts attempted to give blood simply for the money.
A senior health official warned that the department might have to block that tainted blood being imported by
revoking licences of certain manufacturers.
But nothing was done and the chance was missed. In May 1983, the focus shifts to Britain. The Lancet Medical Journal reports that a haemophiliac in his 20s has contracted a life-threatening disease, AIDS, from infected blood products. The reaction is immediate. The story hit the newspapers and the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was questioned in the House about why the government had ignored warnings about contaminated blood products from America.
Will the Prime Minister rectify that deplorable and disgraceful mistake by immediately authorising the necessary expenditure within the National Health Service to make Britain independent in its blood supplies?
Within a week, the government's chief advisor on public health surveillance, Dr Nicol Galbraith, wrote to the Department of Health to tell them unequivocally that he has come to the conclusion that the risk from AIDS meant that
all blood products made from blood donated in the USA after 1978 should be withdrawn from use.
His letter went to the Committee on Safety of Medicines, but this was to be the third missed chance. The experts at that meeting decided not to stop imports of American Factor VIII. As a result, haemophiliacs continue to be exposed to HIV infection. If the Department of Health had acted on Dr Galbraith's warnings, hundreds of people could have been spared from HIV infection. Many haemophiliacs blamed the health ministers at that time.
I cannot comprehend how they could ignore the warnings. So when a health minister is told that there is this really severe threat to the public and to specifically a haemophilia patient group, how else is a politician meant to react but stop at all cost that actually getting into contact with the human population?
One of the health ministers, Kenneth Clarke, was asked in the Commons about imports of plasma and blood products. Campaigners accuse him of giving a crafty answer which obscured the true situation.
As far as I know, no human blood plasma is imported into the United Kingdom by the NHS.
Haemophiliac campaigners say he should have known Britain was still importing infected Factor VIII.
Kenneth Clarke specifically was playing games in many of the answers he gave politicians who were concerned about the risks.
One donor whose identity only became known...
As Lord Archer highlights in today's report, Kenneth Clarke continued to make reassuring noises. Meanwhile, the NHS carried on injecting haemophiliacs with infected blood, and some of them started dying of AIDS as a result.
There is no conclusive evidence that AIDS is transmitted by blood products.
A Conservative spokesman told Newsnight, in the Archer report, Mr Clarke was referred to only once and was not subject to any allegations, let alone an adverse finding. Britain dealt with this differently from other countries. In France, the health minister and a former prime minister were charged with manslaughter for their role in allowing infected blood to be given to haemophiliacs. Lord Owen is suspicious that Whitehall got rid of documents that might have led to similar charges here.
Personally, I do think the fundamental question is, did the civil service collectively, if you like, at some stage in the middle 80s, take fright at what was happening legally in France with the case against the former health minister, who by then being Prime Minister, Fabius, and did they decide that they were going to effectively make sure that that couldn't happen in the UK? And there are a lot of pointers in this report which indicate that.
The haemophiliacs have received small ex gratia payments, but in Ireland the government paid out 10 times as much.
First, we want to say to the government, you really ought to be a little more generous than you've been up to now. Many other countries which have had a similar disaster are paying much more money to those who were infected because they're in need. They have lost their jobs and things of that kind. And what we want to say is, without suggesting any specific amounts, we thought an indication would be what the government of Ireland is paying at the moment.
But for Hayden, compensation won't put everything right. The hepatitis C, which was injected into him in the infected Factor VIII, has damaged his liver and led to cancer.
Now I've reached the stage where a liver tumour has appeared in my liver. It's at the stage of 3.5 centimetres. If it gets to 5 centimetres, I'll be taken off the transplant list. I cannot get any more prioritised than I am at the moment. And unfortunately, it's down to fate. If I get one, I'll be saved. If I don't, I will die.